live here in our small start. Oop, Hear someone breathing really loud. I'm going to try to figure out who that is. I'll mute everyone's mics. I'll turn them on one at a time to see who it is. Welcome, everybody. This is just a soft start. We're just going to iron out some tech here. Oh, Pat.
Yeah.
Yeah, we got a lot of sound coming from your screen.
A lot of what?
A lot of sound. It sounds like I don't think it's you breathing, but it sounds like a rhythmic, almost like a wave. Everybody else hearing that?
Yeah. Do you have a fish tank?
Do I have a what?
A fish tank or something? That's what it kind of sounds like. Or
No, it might be the radiator.
Yeah, that's just really.
Let me put the headphones back on.
Yeah, maybe we'll go with that.
That might help.
We'll just say hello to people who are watching. I see Laurel Hightower Wells is here. Hey, Laurel. We were just talking about right as the video was running. We were talking about how everyone picked such great stories and how all the guests' stories really fell in a nice range between the classic and as ghost stories started to change, and then also a nice selection of really stuff that's happening today. And it was y'all make it look easy. Shane is here. Hey, Shane. We're gonna give a couple minutes just to let people come. Pat, that sounds much better. Thanks so much.
Better?
Sorry, it's like on again, off again, on again there.
No problem.
Yeah, Shane and Laurel, in addition to being talented writers, they if you haven't checked out the fabulous Ink Heist podcast, we love Ink Heist. And in just a few minutes, we'll do the real start, and we'll get to ghost stories. Here in New York, it's a dreary day. Is no snow. Has it snowed up by you yet, David?
Oh yeah, it snowed all day, but it was very. It didn't stick, like the grown-ups like to say. It don't stick.
Those damn grown-ups who don't let us go out and play in the snow.
Man. Yeah, it's supposed to snow like hell though later this week, so I'll be happy.
Yeah, it's I think Wednesday to Thursday we're supposed to be getting that snow. I think it's supposed to stick, which goes good with ghost stories and December, especially if you don't have to be out in it and you can be cozy inside from it.
I see how you did that. Nice.
All right. So we're gonna run those credits again. We'll do our real start. Okay, starting the show. Welcome, everybody. The telling and reading of ghost stories during long, dark, cold December nights is a ritual that dates back to at least the 18th century. And once upon a time was as much as a part of Christmas as decorating trees, feasting, and singing carols. During Victorian times, many magazines ran ghost stories specifically for the season. The once strong tradition has been on the wane. It is not on the wane tonight. Welcome to the New York Ghost Story Festival, an annual event of ghost story readings and discussion featuring authors of the uncanny, strange, and fantastic from New York and around the country and around the globe. My name is Daniel Braum, and I'm not muted. I'm always, my superpower is to mess up engineering, but I think I'm doing okay right now. I am Daniel Braum. I'm the founder of the event. I'm your host tonight. I'm an author of strange tales and ghost stories. My most recent book of them is Underworld Dreams. This is the first year of the festival. Welcome to the third night. This year, due to COVID, we are online only. We're going to be back in 2021 and hopefully with a mix of in-person and online events then. I'm here with Michelle Garza, Joe Kaplan, David Surface, and Pat Wehl. I'll introduce them fully in just a moment after I make some opening comments. Over the 6 nights of the festival, we'll explore and visit with some early ghost stories, some classics. We'll talk about some of the authors and the stories that expanded the forum throughout time. And we'll get to hear some new favorites and modern stories that are written very recently. We've heard some classics from Wouldn't Be Complete Without M.R. James, and already we've heard some newer works from Gwendolyn Keist and Sarah Langan. So I've been having a great time, and there's been some great stuff coming through. The next festival dates are this Saturday, December 19th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time with Brian Evanson and Jeff Ford. Then on after that is December 20th at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's 4 o'clock on Sunday. And we're going to wrap it up on Christmas Eve, the 24th at 7 p.m. should you be able to join us. The festival is not for profit. It's an educational and artistic venture. We have a Ko-Fi account or coffee account. I'll mention that during the course of the night. Donations made there will go towards subscription, production, and advertising costs. The other bit I want to mention is I've asked all our authors to give us the name of a local or indie bookstore. So if you hear something that we're talking about that you like or you want to look for it, you could check there first. I began each night of the festival so far with remarks from different editors and anthologists. There's so many different takes on the ghost story. I started off by mentioning Robert Aickman, who called ghost stories as those exploring the void behind the face of order. So I like that. Those that inquire and hint and startle and astonish. We've talked about the ghost story as having psychological purpose. And that's something I think we're going to continue to explore every night of the festival. Tonight I'm going to add comments from an anthologist, Marvin Kaye, from 1981. And he even references remarks from a notable filmmaker. Even as scientists probe the old limits set on human knowledge by orthodoxy, a backlash of superstitions grips Americans. Frightened youth of all ages cast about for faiths that will not crumble overnight. The idea of an afterlife, even a hellish one, has the roots of permanency in it. It suggests a plan, an order to life. Ultimately, lets its believers avoid the heavy weight of self-responsibility. I thought that dovetailed really nicely with Aickman talking about the false order and the chaos of the void. In a recent interview in the Sunday section of the New York Times, recent being 1981 when Marvin Kaye is writing this, filmmaker Stanley Kubrick put it succinctly. Ghost stories, no matter how dreadful, are still ultimately optimistic. They promise shape beyond self. And that's the end of the quote there. Those are interesting thoughts, interesting takes on the ghost story. I don't like talking in absolutes, so I think everything is up to explore. Before I introduce the guests, there is there's one ghost story I wanted to talk about that none of our guests at the festival mentioned, and I wanted to include it. So I'm going to take a minute to give a couple of remarks about it. And it's called The Smoke Ghost by author Fritz Leiber. And it's one of those, I call it, people call it, it's one of those transition ghost stories, that one of the first ones that sort of moved out of that classic phase. In 1941, Fritz Leiber published a short story called Smoke Ghost. It's very notable as it's a different and a modern kind of ghost story. The author let his readers know something was different from his ghost story right from the start. A ghost from the world today, with the soot of factories on its face and the pounding of machinery in its soul. The kind that would slip around at night through deserted office buildings like this one. A real ghost, not something out of books. So the setting of Smoke Ghost is predominantly these deserted office buildings in the 40s, as well as crowded commuter trains and doctor's offices and creaking elevators. So it's at the time it was a new kind of ghost story with a new kind of ghost. And the creature that was haunting the narrator in the story was not a traditional ghost at all. It seemed to be a kind of personification of the modern living, a creature born of smog and pollution, of hate and war and machinery and alienation. That not something out of books line suggests a farewell from the author to the kind of ghost that came before it, a reaction against the ghost as the haunter of libraries, cloisters, and college rooms. To him, modern times required modern ghosts. And he makes that clear as he expands on his theme. Just going to read a little bit more from Smoke Ghost. Have you ever thought what a ghost of our times would look like, Miss Millick? Just picture it. A smoky composite face with the hungry anxiety of the unemployed, the neurotic restlessness of the person without purpose, the high-pressure metropolitan worker, the uneasy resentment of the striker, the callous opportunism of the scab, the aggressive whine of the panhandler, the inhibited terror of the bombed civilian, and 1,000 other twisted emotional patterns, each one overlying and yet blending with the other like a pile of semi-transparent marks. So the Smoke Ghost is all our negatives, comebacks, haunt us. And as if that wasn't remarkable enough, what's also amazing about the story is the narrator goes on to talk about, to try to explain it away, to try to explain the ghost away through psychology. There's an element in the story where he's had some sort of paranormal experience as a child, and his mother was trying to make him into the narrator into a medium. So there's an attempt in the story to explain away through psychology, drawing on his childhood experiences, what he calls being a sensory prodigy, and his mother's attempts to transform him into a medium. The narrator finds himself caught between feelings of scientific modernity and something he describes as something older, something buried deep in the human imagination. So the Smoke Ghost is a crossroads of the story, with the ghost and the atmosphere both paying homage and drawing on the influences of what came before it and evoking those old stories. But at the same time, it's one of the first of its kind of the ghost story that came after it. So let's see what everyone here tonight thinks about the ghost story. I'm going to turn on the mics and going to introduce our guests. I'm here with Michelle Garza. Michelle is a writer of dark fiction. Hey, Michelle. Michelle is a writer of dark fiction.
Hi.
She is one half of the twin sister writing team known as the Sisters of Slaughter. I'm also here with Pat Wehl. Pat, hey Pat.
Hi.
Pat is a Vietnam combat veteran. He has written several stories for David Surface's, another one of our guests tonight, Veterans Writing Workshop, and is now working on a book called Baptism Hill. David Surface is here tonight. Hey, David. In addition, do I have him? And finally, hey, David, how are you?
Fine, Dan.
Are you admiring my engineering superpower.
I'm admiring your twinkly lights around your window.
Just wait till I try to pronounce things with more than one syllable. You'll really get to see my powers. In addition to running the Veterans Writing Workshop, where he met Pat Wehl, he is the author of Terrible Things. He's also the talent behind the excellent videos you see in our festival. And we'll also hear with Joe Kaplan. How are you, Joe?
Good.
Good, good. Joe Kaplan is a Los Angeles-based horror writer, English instructor, and the author of the recent Gothic novel, It Will Just Be Us. So I'm going to turn it over in just a second to Michelle.
Mhm.
Michelle writes alongside Melissa Layson. Their work has been published by Thunderstorm Books, Death's Head Press, and Cereal Box. Their debut album, Mayan Blue, and I noted you said album there, that's Michelle's words, was nominated for a Bram Stoker Award. When she isn't writing, she likes gaming with her sons and listening to heavy metal with her husband. And maybe we'll get to hear some of that on mic tonight. So how's everything going, Michelle?
It's going good, man. Just hanging in there, I guess, with all the craziness going on in the world right now.
I'm not even going to talk about how crazy it is over here. Not even going to mention it. So
Yeah.
I'll ask you about ghost stories. Why is a ghost story appealing to you as a writer? What's the appeal?
I think ghost stories, it's very popular, I guess, the trope, but you could go like all kinds of places with it, because we don't know what a ghost really is, you know what I mean? Or if they're real, what happens after we die? Is it a spirit? Is it just, imprints from the past? I think it's just like really limitless than what people can do with the ghost story.
Yeah, you write, and I know you write, and you're familiar with a wide range of horror. From following your work, I know like some of your work is historical, some of it's body horror, some of it's splatter, and more. How does a ghost story fit into your body of work?
Well, for me, I don't want any limits on anything. So whatever pops into my mind, I'm just going to run with it. There's probably no trope that I would say, oh, well, that's been overdone, because nothing's really like unique. You know what I mean? You just got to go with it and try to make something that's your own.
Yeah, there are no news stories. They're just how we tell them. Do you want to tell us the
Right.
names of a couple of the stories that you've written, and tell us about the ghost in one or two of those?
Sure. Well, recently we've written, well, I'll just name like two or three maybe.
Sure.
There was a story called Bear that was in When the Clock Strikes 13. It's an anthology. And that one we use not only like a vengeful, evil ghost that's going after and attacking this lady, but we also use the ghost of her beloved dog, who ends up being her savior. So that's what I mean with ghosts. You could go in like all kinds of different ways. It doesn't just have to be like a creepy, I don't know, lady scratching at the window type thing. We wanted to use the dog in that sense to show like he was there for her even beyond death. So then we had another story called Fly Away Little Fledgling, and that was in Other Voices, Other Tombs, put out by Cemetery Dance. Cemetery Dance, Cemetery Gates Media. Ooh, Cemetery Dance. But
All
anyways,
these
um,
gates and dances, we can't keep up with the
yeah, I
cemetery.
know. I'm like, too many cemeteries going on.
Yeah.
But hey, Richard, yes, call me. We want to be in Cemetery Dance.
We love them all. We love
I'm
them
gonna,
all.
yeah. But anyways, yeah. So Fly Away Little Fledgling is about a girl who's dying, and she doesn't know well, she's a little girl too, so she doesn't know what's going to happen to her. She doesn't know what happens after death, and she has a bunch of questions like, is she going to go to heaven? How far away is heaven? And unfortunately, she gets influenced by a sinister type of ghost in that story, and the ending is kind of sad. I'll be honest with you. That was a pretty sad ending for that one. But
Yeah.
what was the other one? I was going to mention one more. Oh, I
Yeah,
had a
about
list because I'm so nervous.
oh, I wanted
Oh,
to,
and then the desert. Uh huh.
no, go ahead, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, then the last one I was going to mention was Desert Kisses. It was in Under Her Black Wings. That was also another all-female anthology that we wrote in. And that
Oh,
one is about a woman who's on the verge of death, but she is, I guess, helped helped along by a train of tortured female spirits. So,
is
yeah.
I like the name of, I mean, I like the way all those sound. Is Desert Kisses set in the desert? I mean, that's a silly question, but
Yes, it is.
I'm a
We live in
sucker.
Arizona, so. Mhm.
I'm a sucker for desert stories. It's just one of my favorite settings. So I mean, it just goes on the top of my list to
Oh,
check that one out.
wow.
I mean, yeah, and
Yeah.
it's cool that you mentioned that. You didn't want any limits, and so you've written stories that just on those three, that really you had like a really melancholy one, and you had really the desert
Yeah.
setting, and then and you mentioned the Ghost of the
Mhm.
Dog. I couldn't help but think of Bradbury's. I think it's the Emissary as well. But I think there's a dog
Mhm.
that's in there.
Yeah.
So, before before I ask you about the story that you're going to read from, are there any local bookstores in Arizona that you just want to mention, where listeners might be able to pick up some of the stuff?
Yeah, you could go by Changing Hands bookstore or Poison Pen. They'd probably have some of these.
Cool, cool. You're going to
Mhm.
be reading from, if I'm not mistaken, Angel by Gemma Amor. If you want to tell us,
Yes.
why was this your pick?
Well, I was having a hard time deciding what I wanted to read. I figured a lot of people would maybe be reading the same kind of classics and stuff, and I decided I wanted to try to boost a fellow woman writer. Maybe people don't know her work yet. And this story runs a little long, so I am going to cut it like in a little bit and towards the end. But her writing is just really spectacular. And as a mother, this story, it almost broke me. Actually, it did. I had to read it like 5 or 6 times, almost like get past some of the heartbreak in it because it really made me cry, honestly. So,
Oh
but
wow!
yeah, I
Well,
wanted to give her a boost. I love
okay.
helping other women and stuff in horror.
Well, thank you so much for doing that. I mean, I'm really glad. I'm really glad that you're here in the festival. I'm really glad that, yeah, you can bring a story. I haven't heard it yet, so I'm really looking forward to hearing it, and really glad that you can boost her signal as well. So here
Yeah.
is here is Angel by Gemma Amor. Take it away.
Thank you so much. Okay. She beckoned for the officers to follow and led them down a narrow corridor to Layla's room. It was easy enough to single out because someone, God, seriously? Nobody calls me until now. Awesome. Sorry. She
Okay, yeah,
beckoned for the officers to. I'll just go again. I'm sorry.
yeah,
She
take a
beckoned
breath
for
and
the.
it's back.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
And led them down a narrow corridor to Layla's room. It was easy enough to single out because someone, another child, maybe the same child that had placed the call to 911, had shakily drawn the name on the outside of the bedroom door in blue crayon. Only they spelled it wrong, so it said Layla. And that tiny detail, that tiny little spelling mistake, so innocuous and well meaning, would stay with both police officers for a long, long time, haunting their dreams in lurid, scribbled blue. At first, Angel mistook Layla for a doll. She was so tiny. She was expecting an infant girl with the proportions of an 11-month-old toddler, but the child they found lying on her back in a near comatose state in a dirty, stinking, urine soaked mattress, spotted with brown stains and black speckled toxic mold. couldn't have weighed more than 8 or 9 pounds at most, no more than a newborn. The sheer state of her extreme malnourishment sent a wave of ice-cold shock through Angel's body, a rushing, roaring tsunami of bewilderment, a feeling of such ferocity that she realized she'd never experienced real, true horror until that moment in her life, until she saw the shallow rise and fall of Layla's chest, until she heard the dry rattle of the child's breath, until she felt her weak, stuttering pulse, touched her cold, rough, scaly skin, and smelled the stink of her days-old, unchanged, overfull, leaking, filthy diaper. And she knew, without question, the child was dying. Dying of neglect, dying of hunger and dehydration, while unsuspecting partygoers gorged themselves on charcoal meat and icy sodas not more than 20 feet away. Angel covered her mouth, gagging at the overwhelming stench of urine and feces and mold and neglect that seemed to fill every single inch of space around her. Salt let fly a strangled curse word. Fuck, he said. Fuck. The fuck is this? His hand trembled as it went to his radio to call for assistance. Angel's vision turned inwards, retreated into a blooming escapist fantasy. She lost sight of the terrible scene in front of her, lost sight of the tiny, twiggy legs and bony arms and sunken, grained face of the ragdoll infant who lay gasping her last in her dirty cot. Instead, she imagined a different version of the child, plump, pink, lively, with sparkling eyes and glossy hair, and dimples and pillowy rolls of fat in all the right places. Behind all this, snippets of conversation faded in and out of Angel's earshot, as if carried on an indecisive wind. Salt asking for backup, ambulance sirens in the distance. A different voice asking Sylvia, when did this child last eat, in horrified, choked tones. Sylvia refused to answer. She was clever enough not to incriminate herself any further with any half-baked excuses or open, unsubstantiated lies. That tongue of hers kept flickering out of her mouth, though, wetting her bottom lip, her only visible sign of anxiety, a lizard basking on a rock, cold blood pumping sluggishly through her veins. Layla coughed weakly. An Angel snapped out of her fantasy, and instantly as she'd sunken into it. She stared down at the baby girl and tried desperately to understand what she should be doing to help. She tried to recall her medical training, but as far as she could remember, it had not dealt with how to treat extreme starvation. She dithered, too afraid to touch Layla, too afraid that even the most gentle of interferences would spell death for the infant. She desperately wanted to rip off the disgusting diaper and pour water into the child's mouth, find a food pouch, jam in as much food as quickly as she could, but she was frightened of making it worse, and so she just stood there. She couldn't even cover the shivering girl with a blanket. There were none. She briefly considered ripping the curtains off the rail over the window, but upon seeing how stained and filthy they were, decided against it. Eventually, as Salt continued to question Sylvia with a mounting, seething fury, he was a father of 4, all of them girls. Angel sank down quietly to her knees beside the cot and delicately threaded her hand through the bars surrounding the child, resting her index finger lightly, so lightly upon the tiny, cold palm closest to her. The child's fingers twitched, but Layla was too weak to take a proper hold of Angel's finger. "It's okay, baby," Angel whispered, and she hoped the child could at least hear her, could absorb some of her warmth through her finger, through the simple act of being touched, and maybe, by proxy, some of her love, because if anyone needed love, it was Layla, and Angel had love to give. She sat like that until the ambulance came, prayers slipping from her mouth like spilled beads, and later, Salt would have to forcibly drag her away from the cot so the paramedics could work on the child. Ultimately, it would be for nothing, because Layla had already left that wretched place, her soul halfway to the stars, while Angel, in a great act of disservice to her own name, remained tethered to the earth, her skin too heavy to allow her to fly. Angel went home later that night and lit a candle. Salt offered to come inside, give her some company, but she didn't want company. She wanted to be alone. Other people were like clashing cymbals to her right now, too demanding of her attention, too jarring in their presence. Salt, however, wasn't taking no for an answer. He'd seen a queer look in her eye when they had received confirmation of Layla's death, a queer, stricken look that went beyond the tragedy of the situation they found themselves in. And he had a fairly good idea what it was that she was struggling with. I'd rather be by myself right now, Angel said softly, and Salt nodded. I know you would, but I'd rather know you're okay first. So I'm coming in whether you like it or not. Angel relented, silently unlocking her door. Her colleague followed her inside and made her sit on the couch while he uncorked a bottle of red wine, moving with familiarity around her home. She wondered as she sat there about the woman, Sylvia. She wondered how someone could be so undeserving of the gift she had been given, a child, a beautiful child. She wondered how someone could regard a human life so poorly as to decide to not feed, to not clean, to not nourish, to not love. She wondered about that last thing the most. How could a mother decide not to love? How did that become a conscious choice, like switching off running water from a tap? Angel went over it again and again and again, but could come up with no answers. People did bad things to people. She knew this. She had worked in law enforcement long enough to see the evidence of that firsthand, but the crimes that had, until today, lingered in her memory the most had been what they in the business called crimes of passion. Murder committed out of jealousy, hate, envy, greed, or lust. All those sinful things she had been warned about as a child. This was the first true crime without passion she'd ever encountered. She said as much to Salt as he handed her a glass, refusing one for himself. He was only there to make sure she was okay, not to impose himself. He knew the booze would take the edge off a little and help Angel go to sleep. Besides, he was anxious to get home to his own daughters and hold them tight. Well, he said, rubbing his chin and staring at the floor, I guess there are a whole lot of people in this world, and at some point we had to meet one like Sylvia. She can't be human. Not to do something like that, human or not. She's going to jail for a hell of a long time, Angel. Take comfort in that. He didn't stay long, just long enough to see Angel finish one glass and move slowly on to the next. He put a hand on her shoulder as he passed her on his way out the door. She patted it with thanks, thinking of a tiny, cold, frail hand, of the tiny, cold, frail hand of the child they found, a child too weak to grip anything. Layla. Angel eventually roused herself about an hour after Salt's departure and went over to the stove to reheat some of yesterday's dinner. She moved around the kitchen robotically, doing things but not really seeing, her head full of the stench of Layla's room, a stench she could not seem to stop smelling, even though it had been hours since she had left that damned evil house. She laid a place for herself at the small table and then paused, thinking. No, not thinking, listening for something. Then, as if in response to a question, she laid a second placemat at the table. From a cupboard, she retrieved a plastic bowl, a plastic spoon, and a rubber sippy cup. She filled the cup with milk and placed it next to the bowl and spoon. After that, she went to her bedroom. On her bed lay four plump pillows dressed in freshly laundered, cream-colored pillowcases. She took one from the bed, hugging it to her, and then she went to her dressing table, took an eyeliner pencil from a bag of cosmetics, and drew a face onto the pillow. The face was sweet, like a doll's face, with wide eyes, rimmed with spidery lashes, and a plump little mouth, and dimples in the cheeks. Angel used lipstick to give the cheeks a faint blush and eyeshadow to color the eyes a bright blue. She examined the pillow, frowning a little. It needed something else. She carried the pillow to her spare room, pushing open the door for the first time in a long time, crossing to a small chest of drawers she kept in there. Opening the top drawer, she pulled out a white cotton dress, small, delicate, unworn, about the right size for a toddler. It had been embroidered. It had an embroidered hem, a wreath of honeysuckles, hand-stitched. She had sewn that hem herself, pricked her fingers until they bled, every tiny puncture a worthwhile payment for what for what came at the end, or at least what was supposed to come at the end. Okay, that's all I'm going to read you for now. I hope other people will check out Gemma's work, and if not this story, maybe some of her other work, and see just the magic she spins with words.
Absolutely. Hey, before we move on to the next reader, can you tell us where can a listener find that full story?
The full story is in We Are Wolves. That's on Amazon now. It's doing really well. It's actually a anthology that's all the money is going to victims of abuse and survivors of assault. So that would be really nice if people could pick that up.
Okay, yeah, fantastic. Now is that so that's We Are Wolves, and that's edited by Gemma Amor, Laurel
Yes.
Hightower, and Cynthia
Uh,
Paleo.
yes,
All
it was
right.
put out by Burial Day. So yes, check that one
Okay.
out, guys.
All right. Yeah, be sure to check that out. Thank you so much for your
Thank you.
reading. Yeah, stick around
Thanks.
for everybody else
Definitely.
here. Um, thank you so much, Michelle. Next up is Pat Wehl. Pat Wehl is a Vietnam combat veteran and self-proclaimed fledgling writer. He was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. He has written several stories for David Surface's Veterans Writing Workshop and is now working on a book entitled Baptism Hill, a collection of stories pretending to be a novel. Pat has played drums for 7 different bands, and he's played in such legendary places as CBGB's, Manny's Car Wash, and 7th Avenue South. Pat's writing can be found in Afterwards, Making Peace, and Afterwards, What I Had to Do, both which are available from veteranswritingworkshop.org. How are you doing, Pat?
Okay, how you?
I'm hanging in there. How? My first question for you is, it's for. By the way, it's great. It's great to see you. It's great to have you here on this dreary. You're a New Yorker
Thank
too,
you.
on this dreary December 9th. But how have your experiences as a veteran and musician shaped you as a writer, Pat?
Well, to me, the Vietnam War was just a totally surreal nightmare. And the thing is that when you live in that surreal nightmare for 365 days, day in and day out, that surreal nightmare becomes your new normal. So you live that day in and day out, and then one day your time is up and they put you on a plane and zap, you're back home. And suddenly your normal way of life has now become the surreal nightmare, because you've been so used to what you've been doing and what you've experienced. So I just find that, in other words, it's a way of
Oh no, I'd love to hear about it. It's really fascinating hearing about what you went through. Did any of that surreal aspect make its way into your writing or into the Veterans Writing Workshop?
Yeah, definitely. I would love to say this first of all, is that, you already mentioned about me and David, and I'm 73 years old, and I've been saying ever since I was a kid that I wanted to be a writer, and never followed up on it. And then I wound up, years and years later, joining the Veterans Writing Workshop. And I have to give props to David, because he's the main instrumental person who has gotten me from going from saying I want to be a writer and now being able to say I am a writer. So I thank you, Dave, for that.
Oh, yeah. Big cheers to David.
So
glad that we're able to be here with David and with you
Definitely.
tonight, and to hear about some of these things.
Well, what was going to say is that, I mean, one of the things after I came back home, I mean, I had thought and talked about writing, a Vietnam book. And I don't, it was going to be a memoir or a biographical novel or something like that. It just never panned out. But then I wound up reading a book by Tim O'Brien, which to me is like the definitive novel about the Vietnam War. It's called The Things They Carried. And O'Brien is a Vietnam combat veteran. He was there, but he wrote this book and it's fiction. And I remember reading an interview with him, and somebody asked him, I mean, you were there, you experienced this. Why did you decide to write fiction? And he said, because it's a lot easier to tell the truth when you're writing fiction. And I heard that, and it was like the choir started singing.
Everybody's nodding. Everyone's nodding with you.
It was like, yeah, it's just, it was like, yeah, that's it. So I've, written several stories for the Vietnam Writers Workshop, and they are all fiction, but every one of them has more or less, to some degree, elements of truth, some things that have actually happened. So it's there's that one story, Baptism Hill, which I think you read, Daniel.
Yeah.
And that was really therapeutic for me, because it was like the story is basically the whole story is a narrative of the protagonist, which is me. It's a fictional version of me, but it is me talking to a psychiatrist. And I was able to get a lot off my chest writing that story. And again, a lot of the elements in that story are based on true events. That the whole beginning sequence about the opening, the first night in the induction center in Fort Jackson, is a totally true story. It's embellished because I don't remember who these people were. I don't remember what they look like. I don't remember their names. So I embellished that and created characters, but the whole story about that night in the induction center in the tent with those three other guys is a true story.
And I know you've been, in addition to all your other pursuits and all your other life experiences, you've been a reader and a aficionado of genre, of horror, of science fiction, of fantasy, for your whole life. I know, just talking with you and interacting with you. How have your experiences informed your taste as a reader? And perhaps you want to talk about one of the ghost stories you brought up. I kind of spilled the beans, and I mentioned The Emissary. Why is The Emissary one that works so well for you?
I just briefly want to mention, Gwendolyn talked about it the other night, the story The Lake by Ray Bradbury. And both of those stories are in the October country. And The Emissary immediately follows The Lake. And to me, it's sort of like a Ray Bradbury double feature. It's like the two sides of Bradbury. And The Lake is just, Bradbury wrote some really...
Michelle and I are nodding with you.
What's that?
I said Michelle and I are nodding along in agreement.
I saw that. Bradbury wrote some absolutely wonderful stories about childhood and growing up. His October and his Halloween are my Halloween. I experienced the same thing. to me, Halloween is when the spooks come out. And again, talking about Bradbury's writing about childhood, The Lake is just this really sweet story about a guy's childhood and his childhood romance, his first love, his childhood sweetheart. And it's really it's a heartbreaking story. I mean, it just really, I guess I can only say it that way. It's a sweet story. And it's immediately followed by The Emissary, excuse me, which is also, it starts out as another really sweet story about childhood. And then all of a sudden, Bradbury can do this sometimes. It just turns on you. The story basically is about this kid, Martin, who is sick and he's bedridden. And he doesn't specify what the thing is. That's all you need to know, is that he's sick and he's bedridden. And he has this dog, which I guess is the emissary. He has this dog, which Martin attaches a note to his collar that says, "Hey, my name is Martin. I'm sick. I'm bedridden. Come visit me." And the dog goes out and runs around the neighborhood, and next thing you know, he's got his neighbors, the butcher, the grocer, the candlestick maker, whatever, coming to visit him. And one day his teacher comes, and you get the feeling that Martin is kind of sweet on his teacher. It's like a childhood crush. He really, really likes her, and she winds up. I think she winds up in an automobile accident, and she dies. So it goes from, I don't want to, spoil it for people who haven't read the story, but it's Bradbury's doing this thing where, in other words, and he uses the same line with a couple of subtle differences, that when the teacher first shows up, Bradbury writes, the doorbell rang. The door sprang open. Martin had company that day, and it's the teacher.
Yeah.
And the last lines of the story is almost the same lines, but it's totally turns on itself, and it's like the door whispered open. Martin had company. And it's like, it's not a typical ghost story, but it's the thing that came back from the grave.
Yeah, I mean, Bradbury's got that way, certainly that way of depicting childhood, perhaps like no other. And you're going to be reading in just a bit another story that depicts childhood, Where the Woodbine Twineth by David Grubb. Before I ask you about that one, what is it about childhood and ghost stories that works together so well for you?
Well, let me say this is Stephen King wrote a nonfiction book about horror and the supernatural in film and literature. It's called Dance Macabre. And in it, at one point, he talks about the suspension of disbelief. And he, the idea that, your brain, your mind can take something that might be totally unbelievable and make it believable long enough so you can enjoy the story or the movie that you're watching. There are no ghosts, there are no vampires, there's no tiny little creature living at the base of your spine that grows when you get scared. That's from The Tingler by William Castle. but your mind makes it, the suspension of disbelief is that you believe in it long enough to enjoy the story. And King wrote that he compared the suspension of disbelief to a weight. And he said that, children have very little problem lifting that weight because their imaginations are so powerful. It's very easy to lift that weight. And as we grow older, it gets harder and harder to lift that weight. So the idea that, children can just be really affected by a good ghost story or a good, a good, fantastic weird tale or whatever. So I think, the fact that I also find out, that the adults in most ghost stories are the ones that usually suffer the most trauma, because they're the ones that are right up until the end of the story are saying, I will not accept this. I refuse to believe it. I mean, the Christmas ghost story, A Christmas Carol, Ebenezer Scrooge is like, bah humbug, and even goes through the first two ghosts, still not committed. But when he meets that third ghost, the ghost of Christmas Future,
one of my favorite ghosts for sure,
is the most terrifying of the three, and that's the one that just knocks him to his knees. And finally, he's like, "Okay, please leave me alone. I believe. I believe."
So what I'm hearing, Pat, is a man named Stephen King and yourself, two wise writers, are saying it's not one ghost, it's not two ghosts, but for us grown-ups, it's going to take at least three ghosts to get us to suspend disbelief. I think that's what you're trying to tell me here.
No, not really. I'm just saying that.
I'm just playing with you.
Okay.
I just wanted to ask you before we're gonna have you read your selection, but before you read, what I know there's any local organizations or just organizations I know you wanted to give a shout out to before you read?
Yeah, I did want to give a shout out. It's not, well, to me, it's local because I live in it.
Sure.
And it's the Jericho Project. And they are a nonprofit organization which provide housing for the homeless. And they have one building in particular, which is where I'm living right now, that is specifically for military veterans. And, they really, I always say about Jericho, they don't just talk the talk, they do walk the walk. They really go out of their way to provide not only housing, but supportive housing. And they really take care of us. And, I've seen a lot of places, they say, housing for the homeless, and it's, a 9x12 room that, with a shared kitchen and bathroom, and you can barely, walk around in. But these places are like, it's a studio apartment, and they're quite great. So
Can you say the name of the organization again? And is that something that we could connect with them and support them if anyone's listening now?
Yeah, definitely. It's a Jericho Project. And I believe they are, you can just read about them and get in touch with them. It's
okay.
JerichoProject.org.
Okay.
And yeah, like I said, they're non-for-profit, but they have fundraisers and things like that. And, they can always use some help and support.
Fantastic. I mean, thanks for letting us know about that one. Just by means of introduction, the story you're going to read for us is Where the Woodbine Twineth by David Grubb. And when I was preparing for tonight, I looked that up and we were talking a bit about in the sound check. Its original title was called Never Believe Me, and it first appeared in Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine back in 1964. And I think you confirmed that it was also made into an episode of the Alfred Hitchcock Hour. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
All right. So here's Pat Wehl reading Where the Woodbine Twineth.
And I would like to say up front that the story did run a bit long, so I did some trimming of it. So it's, a slightly condensed version. So anyway, and I do prefer that original title, so I'm going to say it's called You Never Believe Me by Davis Grubb. Davis Grubb is the guy who wrote Night of the Hunter. Okay, so here is You Never Believe Me, Where the Woodbine Twineth. It was not that Nell hadn't done everything she could. Many's the windy winter afternoon she had spent reading to the child from Pilgrim's Progress and Hadley's Comportment for Young Ladies, and from the gilded flowery leaves of a spring garland of noble thoughts. And she constantly reminded the little girl that we must all strive to make ourselves useful, and that 5 years old wasn't too young to begin to learn. None of it had helped. There were times when Nell regretted taking in the child that tragic winter when Nell's brother Amos and his foolish wife had been killed. Eva spent her days dreaming under the puzzle tree or squatting on the little stool in the dark parlor, whispering softly to herself. "Eva," cried Nell one day, surprising her there. "Who are you talking to?" "To my friends," said Eva quietly. "Mr. Peppercorn and Sam and—" "Eva," cried Nell, "I will not have this nonsense any longer. You know there's no one in the parlor but you." "They live under the Davenport," explained Eva, "and behind the pianola. They're very small, so it's easy." "Hush that talk this instant," cried Nell. "You never believe me," sighed the child, "when I tell you things are real." "They aren't real," said Nell. "I forbid you to make up such tales any longer. When I was a little girl, I never had time for such nonsense." Dusk was settling when Nell, on her way to the kitchen, heard Eva speaking again, far off in the dark parlor. Quiet at first, and then rising, edged with terror. "Eva," cried Nell, determined to put an end to this foolishness. "Eva, come out of that parlor this very instant." Eva appeared in the doorway, her face streaming and broken with grief. "You did it," the child shrieked. "You did it. They heard you. They heard you say you didn't want them here, and now they've all gone away. All of them, Mr. Peppercorn and Bingo and Sam and Popo." Nell grabbed the child by the shoulders and began shaking her. "Hush up," she cried. "Stop it this very instant." "You did it," wailed the golden child. "My friends, you made them go away." For punishment, Eva had been sent to her room without supper, and Nell trembled with curious satisfaction. Before the summer seemed half begun, it was late August, and one fine morning, the steamboat Samantha Collins docked at Cressap's Landing. Nell called from the kitchen window. "Someone's coming today." Eva sighed and said nothing, remembering the wonderful stories that Mingo used to tell. "Grandfather's boat landed this morning, Eva. He's been all the way to New Orleans, and I wouldn't be surprised if he brought his little girl a present." Supper that night had been quite pleasant. The captain told of his trip to New Orleans, and Eva listened to his stern old voice. When supper was over, the captain rose without a word and went to the chair by the umbrella stand and fetched back a long box wrapped in brown paper. "I reckon this might be something to please a little girl," said the old man gruffly, thrusting the box into Eva's hands. "For me?" whispered Eva, and presently string popped, paper rustled, and the cardboard box lay open. and Eva stared at the creature which lay within. Numa, she whispered. What did you say, Eva? Said Nell. It's Numa, cried the child. They told me she'd be coming, but I didn't know Grandpa was going to bring him. Mr. Peppercorn said, Eva, whispered Nell. And Nell made them all, Aunt Nell made them, I'm sorry. Aunt Nell made them all go away, Eva began. Father, Nell whispered, please don't discuss it with her. She's made up all this nonsense. First, it was some foolishness about people who live under the Davenport in the parlor. It's really true, Eva said boldly. She never believes me when I tell her things are real. She made them all go away. But one day Mr. Peppercorn came back. It was just for a minute. And he told me they were sending Numa instead. And then she fell silent and simply sat, heedless of Nell's shrill voice, trying to explain. Eva sat staring with love and wonder at the Creole doll with the black straight tresses and the lovely coffee skin. A week later, the thing ended. And years after that, I'm sorry, I have to interrupt here for a minute. I actually jumped ahead.
No problem. No problem.
No, I just went, actually, because I cut out, like I said, I cut some parts out. So in the meantime, Eva's got the doll. And there are a couple of incidents where Nell is hearing Eva, talking at night. And she swears she hears not just Eva's voice, but another one. She hears two voices. And she constantly is trying to catch Eva at it, but never actually catches her. So this goes on for a couple of times. And so now back to the story. A week later, the thing ended. And years after that autumn night, Nell, mad and simpering, would tell the tale again and stare at the pitying, doubting faces in the room. And she would whimper in a parody of Eva herself. You never believe me when I tell you things are real. It was a pleasant September evening, and Nell was hurrying up the walk by the ice house when she heard Eva's prattling laughter. Nell ran swiftly into the house to the pianola. And she had put the doll up on the pianola and swore Eva wouldn't get it back until she admitted that she was making this up and that there actually was another child, which Eva didn't do. So Nell goes into the kitchen and the doll box wasn't there on top of the pianola. She did not call to Eva, but went out and stripped the willow switch from the little tree by the stone wall and tiptoed softly down the lawn. They were laughing and joking together as Nell crept soundlessly upon them, speaking low as children do. Nell approached silently, clutching the switch tightly. She stopped and listened, for suddenly there was but one voice, and it wasn't Eva's. Nell stared through the leaves of the puzzle tree and saw the dark child sitting with the doll box in its lap. So, cried Nell, stepping through the leaves, you're that darky child who's been sneaking up here to play with Eva. The child put the box down and jumped to its feet with a low cry of fear as Nell sprang forward, the willow switch flailing furiously about the dark angles. Now scat, cried Nell. Get on home where you belong and don't ever come back. For an instant, the dark child stared in horror, first at Nell and then at the doll box. its sorrowing, someone's eyes brimming with wild words and a grief for which it had no tongue. Its lips trembling as if there was something Nell should know that she might never learn again. Go on, I say, Nell shouted furiously. The switch flickered about the dark arms and legs faster than ever, and suddenly, with a cry of anguish, the dark child turned and fled through the tall grass. Eva, screamed Nell, come to me this instant. She picked up the doll box and marched angrily up towards the lights in the kitchen. Eva, you're going to get a good switching for this. Nell did not call again, for suddenly the very sound of her voice began to frighten her, and when she was in the kitchen, Nell screamed loudly. She stared for a long moment after she had screamed, not believing really, for it was at once so perfect and yet so unreal. Trembling violently, Nell ran back into the lawn. Come back, she screamed hoarsely. Come back. Oh, please, please, come back. But the dark child was gone forever, and Nell, creeping back at last to the kitchen, whimpering and slack-mouthed, looked again at the lovely little dreadful creature in the doll box, the gold-haired plaster Eva with the eyes too blue to be real. And that's it.
Fantastic. Way to go. Great reading. Got clapping from here. And fantastic reading so far tonight from Pat and Michelle. Stick around, everybody. We're going to introduce our next reader, who's David Surface. David Surface is the author of Terrible Things, his debut collection of short stories, published this spring 2020, by Black Shuck Books. His stories have appeared in genre publications including Shadows and Tall Trees, Supernatural Tales, Night Script, Morpheus Tales, and the 10th Black Book of Horror. His stories have been anthologized in Crooked Houses, The Twisted Book of Shadows, Darkest Minds, and Ghost Highways. A story co-authored with Julia Rust, Tall, Dark, and appears in the Swan River Press anthology Uncertainties 3. David is also a regular contributor to Black Static magazine, where his column One Good Story appears in the case notes section. How are you tonight, David? Good. A
Good,
question.
Dan.
I hope it's okay to ask this question because we've been talking about it all night. In addition to all these other things, you, I believe, you're the director of the Veterans Writing Workshop. Yeah, can you just maybe tell us from your perspective as the person running the thing, what's the Veteran Writing Workshop all about?
Oh, well, it's essentially, a program that we provide free creative writing workshops to veterans and active duty military and their families, free of charge to the veterans. And, we just try to create a place where, they can not only share their stories and tell their stories, but also give them the tools, writing techniques. It's a writing workshop, and the writing that comes out of these workshops is just amazing. I mean, Pat here. Pat is, Pat's one of my favorite writers now. He's outstanding, and it's a guilty pleasure for me, to be able to be in the room with these women and men, and see just these amazing things.
I just flashed some of the comments. In the chat room there, people were clapping and saying how good Pat's reading was there. So and some shout outs to you there.
It was.
On to ghost stories, David. What's I know we're all Bradbury. We're a room full of, or I think we're a festival full of Bradbury fans. What's the appeal of the ghost story to you as a reader? I know you are a writer of ghost stories, but before you were a writer, you were a reader. And what does the ghost story do for you that way?
Well, I mean, ghost stories are funny. It's kind of like similar thing to horror fiction. Michelle was talking earlier about tropes, and those they have a comfort. There's a comforting thing about a certain type of ghost story, like there is about a certain type of horror story. But at the same time, you know, you can run into some ghost stories that just tear your heart out. I think, you know, ghost stories are, you know, everyone knows they've been around for thousands and thousands of years, and I think, to me, as a reader and as a writer, what I like about them is they really challenge our assumptions about reality. They kind of rip away our like easy answers that we have. I think one thing to be careful of. It's interesting. You know, I like psychological horror and psychological approach to ghost stories, but there's this thing that happens when people start talking too much about. It was sort of the birth of the modern ghost story in the 20th century, when people critics and readers and writers wanted to be intellectually respectable. They had to find a way of explaining the ghosts, and you know, ghosts are talked about as symbols and metaphors for other things. As far back as Shakespeare was a Banquo's ghost, right? And Macbeth is supposed to be symbolic or metaphoric, you know, like a metaphor for Macbeth's guilt at committing these horrible crimes. Turn of the Screw, you know, Quint and Jessup are supposed to be like metaphors or manifestations of the governess's sexual repression or whatnot. And what's funny about it is that these people who talk about ghost stories this way, they're trying to dig deeper, but what they do is they end up in a more shallow place. Because I think, like, when you talk about a ghost as just a metaphor, just a symbol for something else, and what you've done is you've taken away the power. You've taken away the power of the ghost and of the ghost story.
Yeah, I think there's some wisdom in what you're saying, and maybe it's just the Libra in me that wants to or has it both ways. Like, I think I'm a big proponent, not even on psychology. Well, on the one hand, I love symbolism in fiction. I'll be the first to say that when symbolism lines up too neatly, like, oh, the ghost is a symbol of his repressed feelings, or the ghost is a symbol of X, or anything is a symbol, I think stories don't work well for me as a reader. I think that when it robs it of certain powers. That being said, when there's symbolism going on, when there's deeper layers there, and maybe it's not so clean. I'm just thinking last episode, Sarah Langan was talking about The Shining, and you know, she was talking about the psychological element that was going on there, but it also wasn't clean, and there's also so much going on. I feel like that's where the stories really start to sing for me. You know, I'm fine for stories being maybe I'll call them an entry level, like maybe okay, it's a clean metaphor, it's a clean one-on-one, so the English teachers can teach them to grade school kids. I'm fine with that, but some people can do much more. A ghost story, one of the ghost stories that you mentioned to me that you really enjoy is 20th Century Ghosts by Joe Hill. Maybe tell us a little bit about the ways Joe Hill is operating with the ghost in that story.
Right. Well, it's an amazing story, and it's an unusual ghost story in many ways. I don't know how many folks have read it, but it's essentially, in one sentence, it's a story about a haunted movie theater. and this protagonist who is he grows up going to this movie theater all the time. He gets one of his first jobs there, and he ends up as the owner manager of this movie theater, which is kind of an art house or a vintage film thing. They show the classics all the time. So at one level, the story is about this love, this deep, deep, abiding love of movies, and really just about loving something so much because it just gives your life meaning. But the theater is haunted, and it's terrifying. I don't want to say too much about it, but one thing that he does that's really, really fascinating to me is that, most ghost stories, especially modern ghost stories, it's like the protagonist or somebody is the only one who sees the ghost because they are the crazy one or they are the repressed one or whatever. In this story, the protagonist starts to find out that more and more and more people have shared his experience, and they kind of come together at long distance, like communicating with each other, and it forms this. So there's this sense of opening up. It's like a communal experience for all of them. It's really quite moving, and by the way, it is one of the most moving supernatural stories I've ever read. I cannot fail to kind of tear up at the end of it every time. And it's great.
So yeah, I started off tonight, talking about Fritz Leiber and moving into that different ushering in the era of a psychological ghost story, the new ghost story. But let's turn the clock back a little bit. He was moving away from the days of M.R. James, and we heard about some M.R. James on Saturday. We talked about his classic "Oh Whistle" and I always mangle the name, and "Come to Me, Oh Lad," where right, that's not a psychological ghost story. I mean, the ghost in that story, while it's not as ambiguous as an Aikman, like that ghost is something monstrous. That ghost is something weird. It's hairy and physical, and if it's a symbol of something, who knows? Like Aikman says, the ghost stories are about ripping off that face of order, and the ghost stories are about the chaos of the void. Which is, hey, look, I'm all for having this psychological element. I love it, but yeah, let's talk about the void and for a second there. Why do ghosts and weird fiction? I mean, we can talk about how many angels dance on the head of a pin about what's horror, what's weird fiction, what's ghost stories. But yeah, why do ghosts and the weird work so well together?
Well, I think it's the same. You're right. I think it's the same thing. It's just they defy our easy explanations. They just do. This thing about explaining away. It's a real. It's a really interesting thing. There was an editor of Aegeus Press, Mark Beach. He recently put out an anthology called Crooked Houses. I was very happy to have a story in there. But when he sent out, he invited people to submit stories, and part of his guidelines were he says these ghosts, you should write about haunted houses. These ghosts should not be explainable. So they should not be able to be explained away in that easy 20th century way. So I think that there's I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, I love good psychological, underpinning to a story, and that the character has some kind of flaws that invite the supernatural, some kind of crack that allows the supernatural in. So yeah, I mean, the connection between psychology and the supernatural in these stories can be very, very powerful. But again, I don't think it can just be that.
Yeah, I mean, you're preaching to the choir right here. I mean, I think the unexplainable is so much more challenging and frightening to me, and I believe when you have stories that have the element of the unexplainable, they don't have to be about the rules anymore. They don't have to be about the standard anymore. And like, so not only is it freeing in that way, it's freeing also to be, the stories are free to be about something else, anything else. And that's why I think we're in, there's just a fantastic group of weird fiction writers right now who are working that way. Thankfully, there are publishers and editors, and that's why I'm just really excited about fiction right now. But you're going to take us back. Speaking of weird fiction, we're going to go back to the origins, to Algernon Blackwood, and you chose what you're going to be reading for us in just a second. You're going to be reading from The Empty House. Why was that your pick?
Well, it's a weird pick in that if you know, people out there are familiar with Blackwood, most of his most famous stories are like take place in the great outdoors. You know, famously, he wrote about the terror of being out there.
The Wendigo and the Willows.
The Wendigo and the Willows are the top two amazing stories, just game-changing stories there. And he spent time out there, so he knew why it was scary to be alone in the middle of wilderness or woods or a river, and he communicated that really, really well. The story I'm going to read tonight, The Empty House, is, I mean, at one level, it's just a good old-fashioned haunted house story. It takes place in a house in a city, so that's a little unusual for him. But the reason that I like it, of course, it's fun to read. It's just fun as hell to read. But he does something in the story that he does in many of his stories, and he does it so well. And that is to show us what's going on inside people who are having these experiences. My black cat just jumped on my desk. He may show him.
It's good luck. It's good luck when a black cat.
It's auspicious. It's auspicious. Anyway, Blackwood had this wonderful way of. So he said once, he sort of famously, he said, "I'm not really as interested in ghosts as I am in the people who see them." And you know, for me, yeah, you heard that before. I mean, for me, it's just like the question is not what is a ghost like, but it's like what's it like to see one.
Brilliant.
What is that experience? Yeah, yeah. And he's just amazing passages in his stories with people just trying to make sense of what's happening to them. That's what I love about him.
Mm. So before you launch into your reading, do you have a bookstore or something to recommend for us?
Yes. You mentioned bookstore. I second what everyone says tonight is great. I second Pat's recommendation for Jericho Project. It's a wonderful organization. But in terms of bookstores, we don't have any here in Cornwall. But about 45 minutes north of here in New Paltz, there's the Inquiring Minds bookstore. They are an amazing indie bookstore. They have two locations, one in New Paltz and one in Saugerties, New York, Hudson River Valley. Our friend Mr. John Langan, I believe he's in New Paltz, and he knows the Inquiring Minds because every time I step in there, they have John Langan's books all in a row up there, and they're autographed.
Another reason to support them.
Another reason to support them. But they're just a marvelous bookstore. They're one of these. It's like the bookstore of your dreams. You walk in the door, and there's all the overstuffed old chairs and the rows and rows of books, and you feel like a cat is going to jump on your shoulder and ask you what you're reading any minute. But they have an amazing, just in-depth category of so many categories of books. They have a display of like indie literature, chapbooks, handmade books, not buried in the back somewhere, but like right when you walk in. So it's just this wonderful combination of smart and sweet. And they're open right now physically. You can go in. They have safety protocols in place. They also have curbside pickup, I just found out, and their online store is open for purchases. So, they're good books. They're a good indie bookstore to support.
I am longing to go there, and I know when I'm back out in the world, that's one of the first places I'm going to be going. So take it away. Here's David Serpis reading Algernon Blackwood.
Okay, I'm going to do like Pat and Truth in Advertising. I eviscerated the story a little bit to get it to fit into the 15 minutes. So I encourage you to read the original, but still powerful at any weight. The Empty House by Algernon Blackwood. Certain houses, like certain persons, manage somehow to proclaim at once their character for evil. And there was manifestly nothing in the external appearance of this particular house to bear out the tales of horror that was said to reign within. It was neither lonely nor unkempt. It stood crowded into a corner of the square and looked exactly like the houses on either side of it. And yet this house in the square, that seemed precisely similar to its 50 ugly neighbors, was entirely different, horribly different. Wherein lay this marked invisible difference is hard to say. It cannot be ascribed wholly to the imagination, because persons who had spent some time in the house, knowing nothing of the facts, had declared positively that certain rooms were so disagreeable that they would rather die than enter them again. When Shorthouse arrived to pay a weekend visit to his Aunt Julia in her little house on the sea, he found her charged to the brim with mystery and excitement. He'd only received her telegram that morning, and he had come anticipating boredom. But the moment he touched her hand and kissed her apple-skin wrinkled cheek, he knew something was in the wind. "I've got the keys," she whispered. "I've got the keys of the haunted house in the square, and I'm going there tonight." Shorthouse was conscious of the slightest possible tremor down his back. "But you can't go alone," he began. "Well, that's why I wired for you," she said. The ugly, lined, enigmatical face was alive with excitement. "I should not dare go alone, but you're afraid of nothing, I know." "Thanks so much," he said again. Is anything likely to happen?" "A great deal has happened," she whispered. 3 tenants have come and gone the last few months, and the house is said to be empty for good now." In spite of himself, Shorthouse became interested. His aunt was so very much in earnest. "The house is very old indeed," she went on. "The story dates back a long way. It has to do with a murder committed by a jealous stableman who had some affair with a servant in the house. But one night he managed to hide himself in the cellar. When everyone was asleep, he crept upstairs to the servants' quarters, chased the girl down to the next landing, and before anyone could come to the rescue, threw her over the banister into the hall below. And the stableman was caught, I believe, and hanged for murder, but it all happened a century ago." Shorthouse was not particularly nervous for himself, but he hesitated a little on his aunt's account. "On one condition," he said at length, "that if anything really horrible happens, I mean, you're sure you won't get too frightened?" "Jim," she said scornfully, "with you, I should be afraid of nothing in the world." Slowly they walked along the empty streets of the town. A bright autumn moon silvered the roofs, casting deep shadows. There was no breath of wind, and the trees in the formal gardens by the seafront watched them silently as they passed along. A few minutes later, they stopped before a tall, narrow house that rose before them into the night, ugly in shape and painted a dingy white. Shutterless windows without blinds stared down upon them, shining here and there in the moonlight. Taking a look over their shoulders to make sure they had not been followed, they went boldly up the steps and stood against the huge black door that fronted them forbiddingly. But the first wave of nervousness was now upon them, and Shorthouse fumbled a long time with the key before he could fit it into the lock at all. A stray puff of wind wandering down the empty street woke a momentary rustling in the trees behind them, but otherwise this rattling of the key was the only sound audible. And at last it turned in the lock, and the heavy door swung open and revealed a yawning gulf of darkness beyond. With a last glance at the moonlit square, they passed quickly in, and the door slammed behind them with a roar that echoed prodigiously through the empty halls and passages. But instantly, with the echoes, another sound made itself heard. And Aunt Julia leaned suddenly so heavily upon him that he had to take a step backward to save himself from falling. A man had coughed close beside them, so close that it seemed they must have actually been by his side in the darkness. Shorthouse at once swung his heavy stick in the direction of the sound, but it met nothing more solid than air. and he heard his aunt give a little gasp behind him. "There's someone here," she whispered. "I heard him. Oh, get a light, quick," she said, as her nephew, fumbling with the box of matches, opened it upside down and let them all fall with a rattle to the stone floor. In another minute, they had a candle burning, and when the first flare had died down, he held the impromptu lamp aloft and surveyed the scene. They were standing in a wide hallway. The broad, uncarpeted staircase rose in a sweep before them. Everywhere draped in shadows, except for a single spot about halfway up where the moonlight came in through the window and fell on a bright patch on the boards. As Shorthouse peered up into the well of darkness and thought of the countless empty rooms and passages in the upper part of the old house, he caught himself longing again for the safety of the moonlit square, or the cozy bright drawing room they had left an hour before. Then, realizing that these thoughts were dangerous, he thrust them away again and summoned all his energy for concentration on the present. "Aunt Julia," he said aloud severely, "we must now go through the house from top to bottom and make a thorough search." The echoes of his voice died away slowly all over the building, and in the intense silence that followed, he turned to look at her. In the candlelight, he saw that her face was already ghastly pale, but she dropped his arm for a moment and said in a whisper, stepping close in front of him, "I agree. We must be sure there's no one hiding. That's the first thing. You feel quite sure of yourself. It's not too late." "I think so," she whispered, her eyes shifting nervously toward the shadows behind them. "Quite sure. Only one thing." "What's that?" "You must never leave me alone for an instant. As long as you understand that any sound or appearance must be investigated at once, for to hesitate means to admit fear, and that is fatal." "Agreed," she said a little shakily after a moment's hesitation. "I'll try." Arm in arm, they went into the big dining room. There was not a stick of furniture to be seen. Bare walls, ugly mantelpieces, and empty grates stared at them. Everything, they felt, resented their intrusion, watched them, as it were, with veiled eyes. Whispers followed them. Shadows flitted noiselessly to the right and left. Something seemed ever at their back, watching, waiting, an opportunity to do them injury. Every moment the strain on the nerves increased. Out of the gloomy dining room, they passed through large folding doors and a sort of library wrapped equally in silence, darkness, and dust. And from this, they regained the hall near the top of the back stairs. Here, a pitch-black tunnel opened before them into the lower regions. And, it must be confessed, they hesitated, but only for a moment. With the worst of the night still to come, it was essential to turn from nothing. "Come on," he said peremptorily, and his voice ran on and lost itself in the dark, empty spaces below. "I'm coming," she faltered, catching his arm with unnecessary violence. They went a little unsteadily down the stone steps, a cold, damp air meeting them in the face, close and malodorous. The kitchen, into which some stairs led, was large with a lofty ceiling. Several doors opened out of it, some into cupboards with empty jars still standing on the shelves, and others into horrible little ghostly back offices, each colder and less inviting than the last. Black beetles scurried over the floor, and once when they knocked against a table standing in the corner, something about the size of a cat jumped down with a rush and fled, scampering across the stone floor into the darkness. Everywhere there was a sense of recent occupation, an impression of sadness and gloom. Leaving the main kitchen, they next went toward the scullery. The door was standing ajar, and as they pushed it open to its full extent, Aunt Julia uttered a piercing scream. Facing them, directly in their way between the doorposts, stood the figure of a woman. She had disheveled hair, wildly staring eyes, and her face was terrified and white as death. She stood there motionless for the space of a single second. Then the candle flickered and she was gone, utterly, and the door framed nothing but empty darkness. "Only a beastly candlelight," he said quickly in a voice that sounded like someone else's and was only half under control. "Come on, Aunt, there's nothing there." He dragged her forward. With a clattering of feet and a great appearance of boldness, they went on. But over his body, the skin moved as if crawling ants covered it. The scullery was cold, bare, and empty, more like a large prison cell than anything else. His aunt moved beside him like a person in a dream. Her eyes were tightly shut, and she seemed merely to follow the pressure of his arm. "There's nothing here, Auntie," he repeated aloud quickly. "Let's go upstairs and see the rest of the house." She followed him obediently, keeping close to his side. On the first floor they found the large double drawing rooms, a search of which revealed nothing. They opened the big folding doors and came out again to the landing and went on upstairs. They had not gone up more than a dozen steps when they both simultaneously stopped to listen, looking into each other's eyes with a new apprehension across the flickering candle flame. From the room they had left hardly 10 seconds before came the sound of doors closing. It was beyond all question. They heard the booming noise that accompanies the shutting of heavy doors, followed by the sharp catching of the latch. "We must go back and see," said Shorthouse briefly in a low tone, turning to go downstairs again. Somehow she managed to drag after him, her feet catching in her dress, her face livid. When they entered the front drawing room, it was plain that the folding doors had been closed. Without hesitation, Shorthouse opened them. He almost expected to see someone facing him in the back room, but only darkness and the cold air met him. Facing, all was silent as the grave. Undeniably, the rooms were utterly empty and the house utterly still. "It's beginning," whispered a voice at his elbow, which he hardly recognized as his aunt's. He nodded, taking out his watch to note the time. It was 15 minutes before midnight. There came a sound of rushing feet, heavy and very swift, and the next instant the candle went out. As he rose from the stooping position of balancing the candle, before it was actually extinguished, a face thrust itself forward so close to his own that he could almost have touched it with his lips. It was a face working with passion, a man's face, dark with thick features and angry, savage eyes, a malignant and terrible human countenance. There was no movement in the air, nothing but the sound of rushing feet, the apparition of the face, and the almost simultaneous extinguishing of the candle. Shorthouse uttered a little cry, nearly losing his balance as his aunt clung to him with her whole weight in one moment of real, uncontrollable terror. Fortunately, however, she had seen nothing, had only heard the rushing feet, for her control returned almost at once, and he was able to disentangle himself and strike a match. The shadows ran away on all sides before the glare, and his aunt stooped down and groped for the precious candle. Then they discovered that the candle had not been blown out at all. It had been crushed out. The wick was pressed down into the wax, which was flattened as if by some smooth, heavy instrument. So, with as little reflection as possible, he simply relit the candle and went up to the next floor. Here they found a perfect nest of small servants' rooms with broken pieces of furniture, dirty cane-bottomed chairs, chests of drawers. The rooms had low sloping ceilings, hung here and there with cobwebs. It was on the stroke of midnight when they entered a small room on the third floor, close to the top stairs. They put the candle on the floor of the cupboard, leaving the door a few inches ajar so there was no glare to confuse the eyes, no shadow to shift about on walls and ceiling. Then they spread the cloak on the floor and sat down to wait. The moon was now high above the house. Through the open window, they could see the comforting stars like friendly eyes watching in the sky. One by one, the clocks of town struck midnight, and when the sound died away, the deep silence of a windless night fell again over everything. Inside the house, the silence became awful. A chilliness, not altogether due to the night air, invaded the room and made them cold. He heard the blood singing in his veins. It sometimes seemed so loud that he fancied it prevented his hearing properly certain other sounds that were beginning very faintly to make themselves audible in the depths of the house. Every time he fastened his attention on these sounds, they instantly ceased, yet he could not rid himself of the idea that the movement was going on somewhere in the lower regions of the house. And suddenly, the truth flashed into his mind, and for the space of a minute he felt as if his blood had stopped flowing and turned to ice. The sounds were not downstairs at all. They were upstairs. Upstairs, somewhere among those horrid little gloomy servants' rooms with their bits of broken furniture, low ceilings, and cramped windows.
All right. Thank you so much.
I'll stop there. Let you guys read the rest.
Thank you so much. Thank you to David Surface. Thank you for that. Before we continue on, I feel like I'm a little bit blurry right now, but that's okay. Before we continue on with Joe Kaplan, a couple of things to mention. Please, to our four guests, please stick around after Joe's reading. We're going to go to the video, but please stick around in the studio backstage just for a minute or two after that. A couple of things to mention to everyone. First of all, thanks again to the four guests for being here, and thanks to people who I see there in the chat room, friends and colleagues, and some new faces. It's been a rough day for me, particularly rough one on this dark December day, but being here with everyone the show must go on. The stream of tonight's show and any other of the festival is up here at the same link on the archive. All 6 of the festival dates. You could watch them. You could watch the festival live. You could watch it on the archive. Just hit subscribe to stay in touch if that's your thing. Also on the channel are other events. One that David Surface and some other people did for Halloween is up there. The book launch for Underworld Dreams is up there. And moving forward in 2021, all the Nighttime Logic events are going to be up on this stream. We have Sarah Langen back with us on January 14th to start out. Our next festival dates are this Saturday night, December 19th, with the great Jeff Ford and Brian Evanson. Sunday, December 20th in the afternoon at 4 p.m. David mentioned John Langen is going to be here with a bunch of guests from across the pond. And, of course, come back Christmas Eve if you can at 7 p.m. If you want to support the festival, we have a Ko-Fi account, ko-fi.com/nighttime logic. You can support me by checking out Underworld Dreams. Underworld Dreams and all my books have ghosts in them. And next up is Joe Kaplan. Joe Kaplan writes and teaches in the Los Angeles area with much encouragement from her husband and 2 cats. Her fiction, sometimes as Joanna Parapinski, has appeared in Fireside Quarterly, Black Static, Nightmare Magazine, Visterion, Haunted Nights, Don't Turn Out the Lights, a tribute to Alvin Schwartz's Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, Spirits Unwrapped, and the Night Script series. Her most recent novel, It Will Just Be Us, came out in September of 2020. She teaches English and creative writing in Glendale Community College. Please welcome Joe Kaplan. And is your mic back on, Joe? Oh, super. Good timing there. Thanks so much for being here with us tonight. Your work deals with the strange and uncanny. What is the appeal for you as a writer of the ghost and the ghost story?
I feel like we've been hearing a lot of really interesting responses to this kind of question tonight, and I've really enjoyed hearing everybody talk about what draws them to ghost stories. I feel like I have kind of an odd relationship with ghost stories. I love them, but I'm also a skeptic. I don't believe in ghosts. So I feel like the ghost stories that really intrigue me are the ones that are maybe not like your typical traditional ghost stories. I love those. I think those are they're those are comforting in a way, but I really like stories that deal with the ghostly and the idea of haunting and the uncanny in ways that play with, I guess, sort of the traditional ghosts. I love the notion that there are things that we don't understand out there, like in the universe. And I feel like I'll start to repeat what other people have said tonight, but I feel like it is that sense of the uncanny and the unknown that really intrigues me. And I don't know why like a skeptic would be so interested in ghost stories, but maybe it's because I don't know, maybe it's because I don't believe in ghosts, but I also believe that there are really strange things in the universe that we don't understand. So something about that just draws me to it, and I want to explore it
That's a
more.
great answer. And as you were saying that into the camera, I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, oh, that explains why I'm such a huge fan of your work. I mean, I just absolutely, I absolutely love that answer, and it's not a secret if you've been anywhere around my Facebook feed for the last few years, you know how much I love Joe's work, and I'm like that right there with you. I'm a skeptic and a not believer as well. So it exactly, um, I really like what you said, and I like those same kind of stories. Just as a bit of an aside, but not an aside, I was just talking. Someone today just asked me to recommend some ghost stories that I liked, and on the top of my mind were a couple of stories that are not expected. The two that came to mind were novels. They were Expiration Date by Tim Powers and 3 Days to Never by Tim Powers. And then those are two that really, Tim Powers just has such interesting and such different uses of the ghost. Um, another great use of the ghost is your short story called The Deepest Part of the Ocean, which appears in an anthology called The Beauty of Death 2, Death by Water, which is by a company called Independent Legions Press. And I think it's such a wonderful, haunting ghost story. Could you tell us a bit about this story and how you use the ghostly elements in it?
Yeah, well, first of all, I haven't read those
Oh,
Tim Power stories, so
yeah,
I'm gonna add them
absolutely.
to my
Put
list.
them to your list. You will
Second
be
of
in for
all,
a treat. Yay.
I came prepared. So here's The Beauty of Death. It's like this mythology. Daniel Braum, you also have a great story in here. Yeah, I have to say the deepest part of the ocean, like you mentioned, I guess is one of my favorite stories that I've written. So I'm glad that you asked about it. And I was thinking about that, as I was thinking about the idea of ghosts and like the way that I'm drawn to stories that involve that ghostly haunting element without necessarily being traditional ghosts, I realized that actually a lot of what I write does fall into that in some way. I don't often write or I don't know if I've ever written like a sort of traditional ghost story, but I feel like everything that I write involves that sort of sense of being haunted by something. But it's usually not traditional ghosts. So my story in this book, The Deepest Part of the Ocean, is sort of the narrator, really the protagonist, is this like teenage girl, but she's really writing this story about her grandfather who has been telling her about this lost love that he had. His wife, her grandmother, recently passed away, and so he's like living with her family now. And she learns a little bit about this like love story that he almost had, like back in Japan when he was young, with this like woman who came out of the sea. And that sounds really nice, but it's not that nice. There's something very creepy and haunting about this woman. She's not totally human. She's maybe he thinks of her as a mermaid. She's not quite a mermaid. So there's this element, I think, of like the creature story, like a creature from the sea. All the stories in that book are like water themed. Um, but as I was thinking more about that, as you asked that question, I realized that there is this like haunting element. He's sort of haunted by this woman, this creature, and that is exactly, I think, what I love to write. I love to write about people being haunted by things, creatures, people, memories that aren't necessarily your traditional ghost, but that sense of haunting and the uncanny, I think it can come out in so many different ways. So I love
Yeah,
playing
I
with
think it's the
that.
kind of story that David and I were talking about. I mean, there's elements in play, there's things going on. Can I line them up and can I teach an English class about that one? Not sure if I can, because I can just say I can't tell you exactly what happened, but there's a real emotional aspect that was able to come through. And if you ask me what is that story about, I will say if I had to pick one word, it would be being haunted. Um, when I a bit of behind the scenes, I was actually at I think I was at a Christmas book fair when I was reading that story, and I actually was putting together an anthology at the very same time. As soon as I closed that story, I somehow got a hold of your email, or on Facebook, and as soon as I was done with that, I was like, is it possible? I'm putting together a book called Spirits Unwrapped. Do you have a story? Can you write a story for that? And I think what you said back was like, no, it's such a shame because the only thing I have is this thing I'm working on called The Unwrapping Party. And I was like, please let me see that story. So the other one of the stories I wanted to ask you about, that one, is The Unwrapping Party. And so it's a mummy centric story. It's a mummy centric book, but got me thinking how the mummy and spirits and entities sort of go hand in hand, where like the mummy, well, the whole point of the mummy is to be the vessel for the ghost or the supernatural. And yeah, but it's not that neat. The Unwrapping Party is not a neat story at all. Can you tell us a little bit about the entity or the spirit side of what we encounter in The Unwrapping Party?
Yeah, definitely. So first of all, I'm so glad that however it happened, we got in touch.
Hooray!
And I pulled out this one too. So here's Spirit.
Show and tell where I'm
yeah,
unprepared.
Such a cool anthology. I mean, when you contact me and said I'm doing an anthology about mummies, I was like, oh my God, I love mummies. And I think you are exactly right about the idea of mummies and spirits having some connection there, like mummies and ghosts. There's the sense of the ancient, that lingering history coming back. I don't know what it is, but there's something really cool about that. And I thought it was actually wild that I actually had that mummy
And the
story
title, and the perfect title, the perfect title.
I know, it was wild, but so the title, The Unwrapping Party, really just actually came from I don't know how I like stumbled across this weird piece of history, but I found out that in the Victorian era, people, I think specifically in England, would actually have these parties. Like,
yeah, it was such a big thing, bringing back a mummy and unwrapping the damn thing, like a piñata, like a crazy piñata thing.
Yeah, it's so wild. And they'd bring back a mummy, and they would literally have a party where they unwrap the mummy, and they would hopefully be trying to find whatever little trinkets were wrapped up in the linen. But still, it's an extremely macabre.
Oh yeah, culturally, it's awful, and it's an awful thing. But for us writers, it's a fantastic thing.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, the idea of unwrapping a mummy is horrible, but exactly. I was completely intrigued by the idea that this was something that people did. So that was where the idea for that story just kind of where it came from. I wanted to basically just dig into an unwrapping party from the Victorian era, but of course there's more going on there. They're not just unwrapping the mummy, like you mentioned. There's this idea that the mummy is a vessel. I mean, I don't know, like, I'm not an expert in Egyptology or anything, but I am fascinated by what they did with, preserving the organs in the canopic jars, and just the idea of like trying to preserve the body as much as possible so that it could be like re-inhabited by the person whenever, I don't know, Judgment Day or whatever, the afterlife. And so I was really thinking about that idea of that body sort of as a vessel, but as a vessel for what? So yeah, that was kind of a weird story. I mean, just weird in the sense that as I was writing it, it kind of went off in a different direction than I was even actually expecting that it would. And we see this mummy who is actually being used in a ritual, basically to be a vessel for something ancient.
Yeah, I mean, I like that, as a vessel for what? I mean, it's such a fantastic piece of weird fiction. It's such a fantastic piece of supernatural fiction because it does it operates in such an interesting way that I enjoy. Like it starts off, you think you're in an M.R. James story. This is a Victorian setting, and there are people around acting Victorian. And yes, let us unwrap this mummy. Would you like a cordial? And at some point, the freaking void that at some point the void is in your face. It's like, what happened? Wait, where we were just in black tuxes and starched collars, and now we are, you really did a great job of turning the story into something confronting and incomprehensible in all the right ways. So yeah, what a great boundary of the ghost story on that, I just have to say. Taking it back to the beginnings of the genre, in preparing for tonight, you mentioned a bunch of stories. One of them that I wanted to talk about was The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. And maybe this is one of the stories that David was talking about. Is this symbolic? Is this one psychological? This is maybe one of the earlier, is this madness? Is this supernatural? But falling down on the side of just stories with ambiguity, why is it that stories like The Fall of House of Usher that have an ambiguity in it, why do they go so well with ghost stories for you?
That's a really good question. I mean, I feel like if you could say anything about Poe, is he was a master of that ambiguity and the ability to read his stories as either supernatural or, it's psychological, it's madness. I think that not knowing which one it is, or I guess the ability to read a story in both ways or interpret it in both ways, I think it's deeply unsettling. I think that when we know for sure that a story is supernatural, or we know for sure it's just psychological, there's a sense of comfort in knowing what it is. So I think it's really difficult, as a writer, to accomplish a story that has that genuine sense of, this is unsettling because we don't know for sure whether it's supernatural or psychological. We don't know for sure exactly what's going on. And I think we like to know what's going on. And when we don't, it really increases that sense of unease, that there's this ambiguity. We don't know for sure. And I think that Poe was really a master of doing that. There's so many of his stories that you can really read in two different ways, and you can easily make a case that you could interpret it one way or the other. And I think that's what's so cool about those kinds of stories.
Yeah, you put it really well about just another thing about that kind of ghost story is that it taps into the fear of the unknown. And when we have ambiguity, we're not coming to the story on sure footing. Maybe we have sea legs of sorts. Your most recent novel is called It Will Just Be Us, and it's billed as a Gothic novel. Can you tell us a bit about the Gothic style and tradition, and why that style, that tradition, why does the Gothic story work so well with ghosts, as in your novel?
Well, one more show and tell.
Yes.
So there's this one. Yeah. So many of our classic ghost stories came out of the Gothic tradition. Like, that's where, we go back and we think about the classic ghost story. I think so much of it did come out of the Gothic, which really was the genre that sort of really reveled in the creepy and the uncanny and the spooky, and the ghost story. And I feel like, just like I've been talking about with other stories, I really wanted to write something that was in that Gothic tradition, because there's so much to love about the atmosphere, the dread, the sort of lush language that you get in Gothic stories. But again, I wanted it to do something a little bit different. Again, I don't think I can write just your traditional ghosts. I felt like how do we take the Gothic tradition and maybe not just bring it into like modern times? Because even though my book takes place in like now, there's something I think very like there's an old style to it. So it wasn't just about bringing it like into the 21st century, but maybe thinking about the Gothic from maybe from a 21st century lens, or more like from a philosophical lens of from modern times. So in the book, there are ghosts, there's a haunted house, there's this mansion on the edge of a swamp, but the ghosts are, again, they're not like your typical ghosts. They're more like memories that replay over and over again. So you can be walking through this house and suddenly you see like an echo come up of a memory from 20 years ago or 100 years ago of what happened. And again, I feel like maybe that was me as a skeptic trying to figure out if ghosts existed, what would they be? What would actually make sense there? But we find out pretty early on in the story that there's a ghost that seems to defy that. There's this strange, faceless boy who seems to be able to not just replay these echoes, but actually influence through time. So the book plays a lot with the idea of time and the idea of memory, and it I feel like it really messes with time. That was something I was playing around with a lot in the book, the idea of messing with time. So yeah, it kind of comes at ghosts with the Gothic sensibility, but maybe with a modern philosophy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a really, again, there's no right answer. There's only just so many fantastic and interesting ways that we writers can present the ghosts, coming from our point of view, or our intent for any given story. In just a second, you're going to be reading from a story called "The Pale Man" by Julius Long, and this one was published in Weird Tales magazine back in 1934. We've been having a conversation for, it seems like, years now. We've been interviewing each other about each other's stories about weird fiction. And we've been talking about it tonight. Why do ghosts and the weird, in as in weird fiction, seem to just, from Blackwood on, seem to just go so well together?
I think it is a lot of what we've been talking about already, is that, well, I mean, there's the sense of the uncanny, which I think is so powerful in ghost stories, and I think is also really powerful in weird fiction. So the sense of the uncanny being the familiar becoming unfamiliar, right? We want this. I mean, look at the haunted house. You know, it's your house. It should be the most comfortable, familiar place for you, but once it's haunted, what is familiar, what should be familiar, is now unfamiliar and strange and threatening. And I feel like that sense of the uncanny relates to ghosts, and it also relates to weird fiction, because so much of weird fiction is like taking our familiar world and twisting it just enough that it's unfamiliar, and it creates that ambiguity and that unsettling feeling. So I think there's so much that goes hand in hand there between ghosts and weird fiction. And that's also why I chose this story, The Pale Man, because it reads like a ghost story to me, but it's also not, again, it's not like your traditional ghost. There's that sense of weirdness to it.
Yeah, great choice. Really interesting, all the choices, to see how they're fitting together and piecing them on the continuum of ghost stories. So before you launch into it, can you recommend a bookstore or two for us?
Yes. I know Los Angeles isn't known for its literary scene like New York is, but we have some pretty great independent bookstores. The Last Bookstore in downtown LA is just probably the coolest bookstore I've ever been in. It has books like designed in different ways. There's like an archway of books. You can just Google some images. It's so
Yeah,
cool.
that famous picture everyone takes.
Yeah, everybody knows that. But it's such a cool store. And I would also recommend, we have our own little like horror book Pride and Joy, Dark Delicacies, which is in Burbank, and it is it's a horror themed bookstore, and just the fact that we have that is so cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would recommend either of those if you're ever in the LA area.
All right. Thank you so much. And thanks for everyone for sticking around. We've had a bunch of people here who have been staying with the show for the whole time. And now wrapping it up with the final reading is Joe Kaplan. Take it away.
Right. Thank you so much, everyone, for sticking around. This is a fun one. I am reading the whole thing, but it's not a very long story, which is why I picked it. But I think it's a really fun one. It's got a very sarcastic voice, so I hope you enjoy my reading of it. So this is The Pale Man by Julius Long. I have not yet met the man in number 212. I do not even know his name. He never patronizes the hotel restaurant, and he does not use the lobby. On the 3 occasions when we passed each other by, we did not speak, although we nodded in a semi-cordial, non-committal way. I should very much like to make his acquaintance. It is lonesome in this dreary place. With the exception of the aged lady down the corridor, the only permanent guests are the man in number 212 and myself. However, I should not complain, for this utter quiet is precisely what the doctor prescribed. I wonder if the man in number 212 too has come here for a rest. He's so very pale. Yet I cannot believe that he is ill, for his paleness is not of a sickly cast, but rather wholesome in its ivory clarity. His carriage is that of a man enjoying the best of health. He is tall and straight. He walks erectly and with a brisk athletic stride. His pallor is no doubt congenital, else he would quickly tan under this burning summer sun. He must have traveled here by auto, for he certainly was not a passenger on the train that brought me, and he checked in only a short time before my arrival. I had briefly rested in my room and was walking down the stairs when I encountered him ascending with his bag. It is odd that our venerable bellboy did not show him to his room. It is odd, too, that with so many vacant rooms in the hotel, he should have chosen number 212 at the extreme rear. The building is a long, narrow affair, 3 stories high. The rooms are all on the east side, as the west wall is flush with a decrepit business building. The corridor is long and drab, and its stiff, bloated paper exudes a musty, unpleasant odor. The feeble electric bulbs that light it shine dimly as from a tomb. Revolted by this corridor, I insisted vigorously upon being given number 201, which is at the front and blessed with southern exposure. The room clerk, a disagreeable fellow with a Hitler mustache, was very reluctant to let me have it, as it is ordinarily reserved for his more profitable transient trade. I fear my stubborn insistence has made him my enemy. If only I had been as self-assertive 30 years ago, I should now be a full-fledged professor instead of a broken-down assistant. I still smart from the cavalier manner in which the president of the university summarily recommended my vacation. No doubt he acted for my best interests. The people who have dominated my poor life invariably have. Oh well, the summer's rest will probably do me considerable good. It is pleasant to be away from the university. There is something positively gratifying about the absence of the graduate student face. If only it were not so lonely. I must devise a way of meeting the pale man in number 212. Perhaps the room clerk can arrange matters. I have been here exactly a week, and if there is a friendly soul in this miserable little town, he has escaped my notice. Although the tradespeople accept my money with flattering eagerness, they studiously avoid even the most casual conversation. I'm afraid I can never cultivate their society unless I can arrange to have my ancestors recognized as local residents for the last 150 years. Despite the coolness of my reception, I have been frequently venturing abroad. In the back of my mind, I have cherished hopes that I might encounter the pale man in number 211. Incidentally, I wonder why he has moved from number 212. There is certainly little advantage in coming only one room nearer to the front. I noticed the change yesterday when I saw him coming out of his new room. We nodded again, and this time I thought I detected a certain malign satisfaction in his somber black eyes. He must know that I am eager to make his acquaintance, yet his manner forbids overtures. If he wants to make me go all the way, he can go to the devil. I'm not the sort to run after anybody. Indeed, the surly diffidence of the room clerk has been enough to prevent me from questioning him about his mysterious guest. I wonder where the pale man takes his meals. I have been absenting myself from the hotel restaurant and patronizing the restaurants outside. At each I have ventured inquiries about the man in number 210. No one at any restaurant remembered his having been there. Perhaps he has entree into the Brahmin homes of this town. And again, he may have found a boarding house. I shall have to learn if there be one. The pale man must be difficult to please, for he has again changed his room. I am baffled by his conduct. If he is so desirous of locating himself more conveniently in the hotel, why does he not move to number 202, which is the nearest available room to the front? Perhaps I can make his inability to locate himself permanently an excuse for starting a conversation. I see we are closer neighbors now, I might casually say, but that is too banal. I must await a better opportunity. He has done it again. He is now occupying number 209. I am intrigued by his little game. I waste hours trying to fathom its point. What possible motive could he have? I should think he would get on the hotel people's nerves. I wonder what our combination bellhop / chambermaid thinks of having to prepare 4 rooms for a single guest. If he were not stone deaf, I would ask him. At present, I feel too exhausted to attempt such an enervating conversation. I am tremendously interested in the pale man's next move. He must either skip a room or remain where he is, for a permanent guest, a very old lady, occupies number 208. She has not budged from her room since I have been here, and I imagine that she does not intend to. I wonder what the pale man will do. I await his decision with the nervous excitement of a devotee of the track on the eve of a big race. After all, I have so little diversion. Well, the mysterious guest was not forced to remain where he was, nor did he have to skip a room. The lady in number 208 simplified matters by conveniently dying. No one knows the cause of her death, but it is generally attributed to old age. She was buried this morning. I was among the curious few who attended her funeral. When I returned home from the mortuary, I was in time to see the pale man leaving her room. Already he has moved in. He favored me with a smile whose meaning I have tried in vain to decipher. I cannot but believe that he meant it to have some significance. He acted as if there were between us some secret that I failed to appreciate. But then perhaps his smile was meaningless after all and only ambiguous by chance, like that of the Mona Lisa. My man of mystery now resides in number 207, and I am not the least surprised. I would have been astonished if he had not made his scheduled move. I have almost given up trying to understand his eccentric conduct. I do not know a single thing more about him than I knew the day he arrived. I wonder whence he came. There was something indefinably foreign about his manner. I am curious to hear his voice. I like to imagine that he speaks the exotic tongue of some faraway country. If only I could somehow inveigle him into conversation. I wish that I were possessed of the glib assurance of a college boy who can address himself to the most distinguished celebrity without batting an eye. It is no wonder that I'm only an assistant professor. I am worried. This morning I awoke to find myself prone upon the floor. I was fully clothed. I must have fallen exhausted there after I returned to my room last night. I wonder if my condition is more serious than I had suspected. Until now, I have been inclined to discount the fears of those who have pulled a long face about me. For the first time, I recall the prolonged hand clasp of the president when he bade me goodbye from the university. Obviously, he never expected to see me alive again. Of course, I am not that unwell. Nevertheless, I must be more careful. Thank heaven I have no dependents to worry about. I have not even a wife, for I was never willing to exchange the loneliness of a bachelor for the loneliness of a husband. I can say in all sincerity that the prospect of death does not frighten me. Speculation about life beyond the grave has always bored me. Whether it is or is not, I'll try to get along. I have been so preoccupied about the sudden turn of my own affairs that I have neglected to make note of a most extraordinary incident. The pale man has done an astounding thing. He has skipped 3 rooms and moved all the way to number 203. We are now very close neighbors. We shall meet oftener, and my chances for making his acquaintance are now greater. I have confined myself to my bed during the last few days and have had my food brought to me. I even called the local doctor, whom I suspect to be a quack. He looked me over with professional indifference and told me not to leave my room. For some reason, he does not want me to climb stairs. For this bit of information, he received a $10 bill, which, as I directed him, he fished out of my coat pocket. A pickpocket could not have done it better. He had not gone long when I was visited by the room clerk. That worthy suggested with a great show of kindly concern that I use the facilities of a local hospital. It was so modern and all that. With more firmness than I have been able to muster in a long time, I gave him to understand that I intend to remain where I am. Frowning sullenly, he stiffly retired. The doctor must have paused long enough downstairs to tell him a pretty story. It is obvious that he is afraid I shall die in his best room. The pale man is up to his old tricks. Last night when I tottered down the hall, the door of number 202 was ajar. Without thinking, I looked inside. The pale man sat in a rocking chair, idly smoking a cigarette. He looked up into my eyes and smiled that peculiar, ambiguous smile that has so deeply puzzled me. I moved on down the corridor, not so much mystified as annoyed. The whole mystery of the man's conduct is beginning to irk me. It is all so inane, so utterly lacking in motive. I feel that I shall never meet the pale man, but at least I am going to learn his identity. Tomorrow, I shall ask for the room clerk and deliberately interrogate him. I know now. I know the identity of the pale man, and I know the meaning of his smile. Early this afternoon, I summoned the room clerk to my bedside. Please tell me, I asked abruptly, who is the man in number 202? The clerk stared wearily and uncomprehendingly. You must be mistaken. That room is unoccupied. Oh, but it is, I snapped in irritation. I saw the man there only 2 nights ago. He is a tall, handsome fellow with dark eyes and hair. He is unusually pale. He checked in the day that I arrived. The hotel man regarded me dubiously as if I were trying to impose upon him. But I assure you that there is no such person in the house. As for his checking in when you did, you were the only guest we registered that day. What? Why, I've seen him 20 times. First, he had number 212 at the end of the corridor. Then he kept moving toward the front. Now he's next door in number 202. The room clerk threw up his hands. You're crazy, he exclaimed, and I saw that he meant what he said. I shut up at once and dismissed him. After he had gone, I heard him rattling the knob of the pale man's door. There is no doubt that he believes the room to be empty. Thus it is that I can now understand the events of the past few weeks. I now comprehend the significance of the death in number 207. I even feel partly responsible for the old lady's passing. After all, I brought the pale man with me. But it was not I who fixed his path. Why he chose to approach me room after room through the length of this dreary hotel, why his path crossed the threshold of the woman in number 207, those mysteries I cannot explain. I suppose I should have guessed his identity when he skipped the 3 rooms the night I fell unconscious upon the floor. In a single night of triumph, he advanced until he was almost to my door. He will be coming by and by to inhabit this room, his ultimate goal. When he comes, I shall at least be able to return his smile of grim recognition. Meanwhile, I have only to wait beyond my bolted door. The door swings slowly open. The end.
Wow. Great job. I didn't even realize you had a candle going on there.
Great job. Wow. Awesome.
Thanks so much to
That was a
to
cool
Joe,
story.
and thanks so much to all of our readers. What a great night of readings. I want to wish everyone, both on screen and in our chat, a happy holidays, a Merry Christmas, a happy December. Thanks so much for spending this time. I could do ghost stories all night, but the time to wrap up is rapidly approaching. Come back and join us this Saturday, December 19th. Our guests will be Jeffrey Ford and Brian Evanson. We're going to keep the conversation and keep the ghost stories going. I hope to see you there. Until then, stay warm, stay safe, stay inspired, and have a good night as we sign off.